Welcome again, and thank you for being here today as we enter into edition number 5 of our Not a Thing series, in which we've been talking about how sometimes in this day and age we begin to talk about Christianity as a thing. We talk about it like an organization or a club to belong to or something like that. The tagline for this series has been Christianity is not a thing and the church is not a building. And what we mean by that is that Christianity is made up of people. It's made up of us. It's made up of people doing things, living a certain way, saying certain things. So we might even be able to say that Christianity is a group of verbs. It's about how we live our lives and the things that we're doing in the world. And so we've been looking at different verbs that describe the life of God's people throughout Scripture. We talked about verbs like go in Matthew 28. Go, or as you're going, leave this place, go out into the world and make disciples. Seek after God, pursue a relationship with Him. Are we willing to sacrifice for that sort of thing? See, we talked about in John 9, seeing each other and seeing Jesus the way that He sees us. And then last week we talked about hearing. Many of our lives are so busy and loud that we find it difficult to hear each other when we're standing in front of each other. So the question that we posed last week is, if we can't even hear each other, how are we supposed to hear God? And so we talked about creating space, creating quietness, so that we might be able to hear the voice of God. And this morning we're going to talk about serving. Our verb for today is serve. But before we get to that, we're going to talk about chickens. Chickens are a hot commodity these days. I don't know if you've heard, but eggs are kind of expensive now. I feel like that's all everybody's talking about right now are eggs. Eggs are having a heyday. Eggs are more expensive now than they have been. And so, naturally, our attention has turned to the chicken. To be fair, we use chickens for a lot of things in our kitchens. We get a lot from chickens. We use the meat and we use the eggs. My children might starve to death if it were not for the chicken nugget. It is a staple in our house. And so people have been trying to figure out, well, how do we do this if eggs are this expensive? And so people are deciding to buy chickens. I don't know if that's cheaper in the short run, probably not, but they think it's helping. And I actually saw on the news the other day, they did a story that as enterprising people are wont to do, you can now rent chickens. So if you're not in for the full investment, you can just have them for a little while. So if you have chickens, maybe there's a market you can get into. We get a lot from chickens. We use the meat, we use the eggs all the time. But at least by our own language traditions, meat and eggs are not the only things that we get from chickens. It turns out we can use a chicken process in order to describe how we as human beings operate in groups, in social settings from time to time. And it's not very flattering. You see, chickens have a specific way of establishing social hierarchy. Maybe you've heard this phrase before. We call that process establishing a pecking order. Yeah. This article was written by Brian Barth, published in The Modern Farmer, and he writes this. The pecking order is literally determined by pecking. Bigger, stronger, and more aggressive chickens bully their way to the top of the flock by pecking the others into submission with their pointy beaks. First, they strut about, fluff their feathers, and squawk, but if that doesn't get the point across, they peck. It can get violent. Sometimes blood is drawn, and occasionally the opponent is killed. Pecking order rank determines the order in which chickens are allowed to access food, water, and dust bathing areas. It determines who gets the most comfortable nesting boxes and the best spots in the roosting bar. One thing I did not know, humans are also part of the pecking order. Hens tend to respect humans as the default leader of the flock, but some roosters will challenge that wisdom and seek to overthrow the farmer from the top of the pecking order. Aggressive roosters range from pesky to dangerous. Small children have suffered pecking wounds on their face. One option is to put on thick leather gloves and pin an overly aggressive rooster to the ground every time it comes after you, which usually establishes dominance. But if that doesn't work, most farmers opt for plan B, which is the stew pot. So, when we talk about things like pecking order, it sounds so barbaric. It sounds so authoritarian. Surely we as human beings are much more refined than the chicken. And maybe we think that because we've just changed the method. We don't peck each other, but we found ways to assert our role in the pecking order. We found ways to figure out who's on top and who's not. We found ways to puff ourselves up and to sit at the top of the roost, so to speak. Matthew chapter 20. If you have your Bibles and you want to follow along, I will be in two main passages today. The first will be Matthew 20. We'll be there for a few minutes, and then towards the end we'll go to John chapter 13, and we'll hang out there for a little bit. So if you want to follow along, you can mark those places, but we'll start in Matthew chapter 20, beginning in verse 20 and 21. Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down, asked a favor of him. "What do you want?" he asked. She said, "Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and at the other at your left in your kingdom." This scenario is fascinating to me, and I love speculating about what happens behind the scenes. We don't know, okay, so we're just guessing, but I read this situation as it's developing in these first two verses, and I ask things like, what is happening here? Do we have a helicopter mom situation? Is this the mom saying, "Come on, boys, we're going to take care of this"? And she grabs the purse. She says, "We're going to go talk to Jesus." And she goes over. Did the boys put her up to it? Like, "Hey, it might help if it comes from you." Jesus can't say no to a sweet old lady, right? So maybe come and maybe ask on our behalf. What is happening here? What spurred this interaction? We don't know. But what is it that she wants for her sons? She wants the place at the top of the pecking order. Well, at least number 2 and number 3 in the top of the pecking order. She wants Jesus to install her sons in places of honor on the right and the left when Jesus comes into his kingdom. Verse 22. "You don't know what you're asking," Jesus says. There's so much in that phrase. Right? "Let my son sit at your right and your left," and Jesus says, you don't want that, and you don't know what you're asking. You don't know what you're asking. "Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink?" We can, they say. We can. And this is, again, interesting. The boys are there, right? So the mom is kind of kneeling before Jesus, and she asks this request, and then, we find out that the boys are standing there. Is that awkward? So mom's begging on our behalf for Jesus and they're just kind of standing here like, "That would be cool, Jesus, if you wanted to," right? So they're standing there. And so she says, "Let him sit at your right and your left." And Jesus says, "You don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink?" And they say, "We can." Oof, careful. Verse 23. Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or my left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father." Jesus explains a little further. Those are places that are reserved a long time ago. You don't know what you're talking about here. You don't know what you're asking. When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Of course they were, right? How could they not be? In essence, what we have are two of them coming forward and saying, "We think we deserve to be the top. We deserve to be at the top of the pecking order. We deserve to have the top spots." And so the other ones are looking around like, "What are we, chopped liver?" And now you can imagine, again, we're speculating here, but I love the speculation in this story. You imagine that the bickering starts, right? Now they're comparing resumes. "What, you think you get to sit at the top? You couldn't even drive out that demon that one time." "Oh yeah, well I did the next time." "Well yeah, but you didn't before." And then imagine Peter says, "Well, have any of you walked on water with Jesus? Because I did." And they say, "Well yeah, but then you almost drowned." And so they're going back and forth. And they're saying, "No, I deserve it. No, I deserve it." "Well, you don't get it. If you deserve it, then I deserve it more." And here we go. The pecking has begun. They're trying to figure out who sits where. Jesus called them together. Jesus called them together, and he said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus says, this isn't what you think it is. This isn't the way you think things are going to go. The way that you know how things work with the pecking order, and the way that we set up this order and we prove who's at the top, and we let everything trickle down from there. Jesus says we operate differently here in the kingdom of heaven. We are not jockeying for the best place in the roost. Jesus says we have come to serve. And he says not only that, the Son of Man came not to be served, not to take that spot, but to serve, to offer himself at the bottom of the pecking order. Paul will write in Galatians chapter 5, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. Well, we could just go into that for a while. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love, for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command. Think about that. The entire law. All the books of the law we have at the beginning. All those laws. You go through Leviticus, you go through Exodus, you're reading Levitical code. All of this can be fulfilled in this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. Paul begins with this idea that we were called to be free, and what an incredible statement that is. But freedom comes with temptation. Freedom comes with the freedom to choose wrong things. And so Paul urges the Galatians, and by proxy now us reading it, not to use that freedom to, quote, indulge the flesh. Now this is a phrase that we don't use very often, but the flesh here is a representation of our natural desires. Flesh meaning the fallen human nature, pride, self-promotion, self-assertion. Famed German theologian Rudolf Bultmann talks about how going all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, the ultimate sin reveals itself to be the false assumption that we don't get life as a gift from God, but we get it from ourselves. That we don't get life as a gift from God, but that we get it by our own power. Quote, living from one's self rather than from God. And so Paul warns, don't use your freedom to indulge the flesh, which is no freedom at all. Instead, you can fulfill the entire law by loving your neighbor as yourself. And then, as if Paul had chickens on the mind too, he writes, if you bite and devour each other, watch out. You might live high on the pecking order for a while, but sooner or later, a bigger chicken comes to roost. And if that's how you operate, you get unseated. 1 Peter chapter 4, the passage that we began with this morning in our welcome. Each of you should use whatever gift you received to serve others, as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and power forever and ever. Amen. There's a way to operate in the world in which we use our gifts and our strengths and our abilities to climb higher and higher up the pecking order. But not if we're Christians. But not if we're followers of Jesus. We as Christians are called to serve. We're called to offer those gifts to each other. Offer those gifts as the gifts of God that they are, given to us. Why? So that the glory and honor that we might attempt to gain for ourselves by using them in that manner will actually go to the creator and author of those gifts himself, so that God through Jesus would be praised. Our final text for today, John chapter 13. We'll hang out there for a little bit if you want to flip over there. John chapter 13. We'll begin in verse 1. It was just before the Passover festival, and Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. So John is beginning to set the stage in chapter 13. This is the hour of Jesus' departure. The time has come, and Jesus knows it. I don't know about you, but the final hours before any kind of a trip are chaotic around our house. You're double and triple checking the bag. Did we get everything? Do we have all of the children? I've seen Home Alone. I know how that ends. Do we have everything we need? Is the car packed? Do I have everything? This is the time that Jesus is leaving for a much bigger trip than the one that I ever go on. And imagine the temptation to be doing all of these things and setting up things and making sure everything is in line. This is a big moment. The hour has come, and Jesus knows it. And what does he spend the last hours doing? Loving his people to the end. Loving his people to the last minute. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God, and he was returning to God. Imagine, I don't know, very rarely do we say, put yourself in Jesus' shoes. But think about this. The hour has come. The time has come. The end is near. Jesus knows that God has put all power underneath him, and that he is from God, and he is going to God. There is no resume to compare with that one, right? This is the top of the totem pole. This is the top of the pecking order. He has all power that God has given him. He is from God, and he is going back to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist, and after that he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. That makes no sense, right? The language there intrigues me because it doesn't make sense. Think about it again. Jesus, the time is near. Jesus knows the time is near. He knows that all power from God has been put to him, and he knows that he is from God, and he is going back to God. So, he does what? He takes off his clothes, he puts on a towel, and he begins to wash his disciples' feet. This is a disgusting thing to have to do. The foot washer is literally the lowest spot. It is the beginning point for any servant around. It is the place that no one wants to be. We're talking the Middle East. We're talking hundreds of degrees. We're talking leather sandals, with walking being the main method of getting around. And we're talking about laying on a floor or sitting on the floor to eat next to each other. So we've got nasty, sweaty, dirty, muddy, and who knows what else feet. And someone is supposed to wash those before we eat. We wash our hands before we eat. They wash their feet before they ate, because they're going to be close to everybody else. So somebody is supposed to come and wash the feet before they eat. But what happens? Nobody's done it yet. Why not? Nobody wants to assume that place. No one wants to volunteer to be the bottom of the totem pole, the last on the rung. Nobody's going to pick that to do it. So they've just been arguing about who's the greatest. So they're going to sit around, they're going to say, well, I'm not doing that. I'm not the lowest person here. Well, I'm not going to do that. But Jesus, knowing that he was from God and going back to God, and knowing that he had all the power, and knowing that the time is near, did this. If I were to write it, what makes more sense is to say, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, that he had come from God and he was returning to God, but he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist, and began to wash feet. That makes more sense, right? Jesus knew all these things about him, but instead he got up and he decided to serve. But that's not what it says. It says Jesus knew all of these things, and so he did that. What does that mean? We're about to find out. After that, he poured water into a basin, and he began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Here somebody gets it. It's Peter. He says, now hold on a second. You're up here. You don't do this. He says, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. No. Peter says, you shall never wash my feet. Peter's living the pecking order, right? He says, I know where you are here. I know who you are, and I know where you are, and I know that this is beneath you. And so I'm not going to allow you to do that. I'm not going to let you debase yourself to sit at the bottom. I'm not going to let you wash my feet. You're never going to do that for me. And Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. I've always been curious about that teaching right there. Unless I wash you, you have no part with me. But if we go back to what Jesus says earlier, what John says about Jesus, that he was full of the power of God, and he knew he was from God, and that he was going back to God, and that the time was near, and so he began to wash his disciples' feet. Peter says, you'll never wash my feet. And Jesus says, if you don't do this, you will never understand. Because this is who I am. This is having the power of God. This is being from God and going to God. And this is what I'm about. And so if you don't let me do this, you don't get it. You don't have a part in this, because this act is who I am. And Peter just says things. He just keeps talking. Oh, it's so great, because he says what we would say, right? Peter says, oh, okay. Well, if that's the case, then wash my head, wash my hands. If washing is what it takes to be a part of your kingdom, then let's go. Let's do the whole thing. Jesus says, we don't need to do all that. Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes, and he returned to his place. Do you understand what I've done for you? He asked them. No, they don't. Do we? Probably not. Do we understand completely? Still probably not. Jesus says, do you understand what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord. Jesus says, you have these names for me that signify where I am. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightfully so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and your teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Jesus says, this is who I am. This is what we do. If you're one of my people, if you're one of my followers, then this is what we are about. The Gentiles, Jesus says, lord it over each other when they have power. Not so with you, Jesus says. There's a different way of going about things in the world, and that is using the things that God has given you to bless and take care of and treat others. And Jesus says, that's how we're going to operate here. We're going to operate from the bottom up. We're going to choose to do this nasty thing so that other people don't have to. We're going to do it this way. Shane Claiborne tells a story about going to India to visit Mother Teresa. And while he was there, he was staying at the orphanage and they were caring for children. And Mother Teresa walked by carrying this box. And one of the other volunteers pulled him over and said, watch this. And she dumped out the box as she started sorting the shoes. She was barefoot at the time, and the other staffers said, look at her feet. And they were mangled and gnarled and misshapen, basically. And he said, why do her feet look like that? And he said, watch. She lined up all the shoes. She sorted them all out in the box. And they said, every time that the orphanage gets a donation of shoes, Mother Teresa takes them out, she sorts them all, and she takes the worst pair and she puts them on her own feet. Then she gives the rest to the staff to distribute to everybody else. So years and years and decades of wearing the most broken pairs of shoes have made her feet look like that. Can you imagine a world in which followers of Jesus are the people who volunteer to do things like that? To volunteer to take the bottom. Say, you know what? I want everybody else to have something better than what I've got, so I'm going to take those. Can you imagine a world in which followers of Jesus are the people who willingly choose to wash feet? And now we talk about washing feet. It doesn't have the same impact that it does now, and now it's just kind of weird, right? It's a cultural thing. But what we mean by that is finding something that people need, that other people don't want to do. And Jesus calls us to be servants in God's kingdom, to voluntarily do those things, to choose to go to the bottom. The world needs Christians who are not just members of an organization, but people who are willing to take the gifts that God has given them and use them to bless other people. May we take the words of John chapter 13 to heart when Jesus says, these things I've done for you are an example, and you'll be blessed if you do them. May we leave this place today and be servants in the world around us. Will you stand with me? Josh will lead us in one more song. And if I can pray for you this morning, please feel free to come and find me down front. Josh.